And we're 2 minutes past now, so I think we can make a start and get going. So once again, welcome everyone to this CluePoints webinar today on de-risking decentralized. I'm going to hand you over to our main presenter in a moment, but just before we get to the meat of the presentation today, I've just got a couple of housekeeping things that I can run through with you. So first thing to point out is we are going to record today's session, and that will be available afterwards if you'd like to review the presentation again. And on a similar theme, we can also send you a copy of the presentation deck we're going to use today as well. So if you would like a copy of the deck, please send an email to contact@cluepoints.com and we can respond to you and attach the slides. And then finally, we hope to be able to get some feedback from the audience as we go through the presentation today. It's a really hot topic, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions out there in the audience today, and we have the capability for you to ask questions as we go, and we have allotted some time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So feel free to use the Q&A capability that I'll share with you in a second and send any questions through. If we don't get the time on the end to answer them all, we will respond to your questions individually afterwards as well. So next slide, please, John. Just so you know how you can ask those questions, if you're looking at the control panel for GoToWebinar, you can see there is a questions section there. If you expand that, you can see you have the ability to type anything into the question field there and send that over to us, and we'll be monitoring that to pick questions that hopefully we'll get some time to answer at the end of the presentation as well. So with the logistics covered, if I can have the next slide, please, John. It's my pleasure to introduce you to John Hall, who is our presenter today. John is our Senior Vice President for Business Development in Europe and Asia Pacific. And John has over 15 years history within the industry, supporting various different innovative technology solutions. But particularly noteworthy, though, is his recent experience in the space of decentralized clinical trials. And indeed, previously, John worked for a company called Humor, who is a DCT technology solution provider. So John has amassed a wealth of practical DCT experience over the years, and I'm delighted that he's able to share some of that with us today, through the lens of centralized monitoring and risk-based quality management. And so with that said, John, the floor is yours, sir.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. And just to check before I continue on, can everyone hear me okay? Rich, perhaps you can just confirm my audio is
confirmed, John, yes.
Lovely. Yes. And please let me know if that doesn't continue. But Richard, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you also to all the attendees that have both registered their interest and joined the webinar today. We had over 300 people register, and so this really did, I guess, exemplify the broad applicability and the interest in the topic that we have here today. And I'm exceptionally excited to be presenting you on this topic. As Rich said, I've been in this field for nearly 5 years now, and thrilled to be able to continue that under the guise of centralized monitoring and how we can accelerate and enable decentralized trials to deliver on their promise. Now, the goal here today is to share with you our real-world experience of monitoring risk within decentralized trials, and to really engage with you and the wider industry with the ultimate aim of helping to continue to evolve this agenda and move the field forward. I'm not going to present to you on why DCT is risky, or that DCT is risky. Far from it. The benefits of decentralized approaches are quite significant and really allow us to realize a promise and a vision that we've had for a number of years in the industry to really make our trials more patient-centric and improve the speed, efficiency, and reduce the cost of our execution of studies. So the agenda for today is to really start with a very light overview of the landscape and the evolving landscape of decentralized trials, and then to take a look at some of the new sources and dimensions of risks that we see in decentralized studies, and then evaluate how centralized monitoring technologies can provide that effective oversight of key risk in DCTs and ensure quality of new types of data that we capture now. And I'll end with a little bit of a forward-looking view to propose some opportunities of how we can maximize participant engagement and stakeholder interactions to further improve the operationalization of how we deliver decentralized trials. And so with that, let's start with an overview of what DCTs are. Well, essentially, and I'm sure this is not lost on any of you on the call today, but it's essentially a clinical investigation or study in which some or all of the trial-related components, their procedures, how we capture data, essentially take place at locations outside of a conventional clinical site, remote from a traditional investigator. Now, decentralized trial approaches include many facets and many components, and this nice schematic provided by the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, I think, does a very nice job of summarizing that in one nice graphic. You are very welcome. This is available for all of you to download from ePRO's website, and as are some of the other things that I will refer to in the presentation later. So essentially, DCTs include components such as e-consent, the utility of connected or wearable devices to collect more continuous or objective assessments into how patients are feeling and functioning and behaving in their real-world environments. It includes telemedicine to facilitate the investigator and participant interactions remotely, and also the utility of home health care providers or mobile nurses, if you will, to visit participants in their own home to collect and administer and conduct clinical trial procedures. And it also includes the direct to patient supply of investigational product. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, as indeed you should, that a lot of these are not necessarily new. Indeed, we've been using e-consent and eCOA, ePRO in clinical trials for a number of years now. And in fact, the first decentralized trial was conducted nearly 10 years ago by Pfizer, the remote study. And so the uniqueness really here is in the combination of these components in a single trial and delivered through a single technology platform or provider. Now, one of the other advantages of decentralized trials is that there are multiple models for deployment of the various components that we've just talked about. And so this offers sponsors flexibility in how they may want to decentralize the different components of their trial, whether that be adopting a fully decentralized approach or perhaps a more hybrid approach where traditional clinical trial conduct is merged with more virtual or remote collection and administration of clinical trial procedures. So a fully decentralized approach, it does essentially what it says on the tin, where all patient recruitment and data collection, administration of IMP take place remotely from the investigator, and there are no conventional brick and mortar sites involved. In a hybrid environment, there's essentially two ways in which that can work, where conventional sites are augmented with virtual sites, so participants who engage through conventional sites and also through remote investigators can be recruited into their trial, and that decentralized data, or those participants engaging in that virtual arm, ultimately their data is transferred along into the EDC platform along with all the other conventional, all the other participants that are engaging through conventional mechanisms. The other hybrid model is where you're essentially deploying decentralized components across all sites to execute a certain element of that protocol, whether that be collection of ePRO data or wearable data, or indeed how IMP is administered. Now, I indicated at the beginning that there are some significant benefits of decentralized approaches, and I'm sure some, if not all of these, are very much you are very much aware of. Primarily, we are looking at reducing patient burden, reducing the frequency of visits or the requirement for patients to visit specialist medical facilities in order them to engage in a clinical trial. And that has numerous knock-on effects throughout the trial. It is enabling us to improve the speed of recruitment, where participants are no longer confined by the geographical boundaries of conventional sites. Recruitment can now happen remotely, leveraging digital campaigns and with an expanded recruiting radius, not just within the local geographical boundary of the conventional site. We've also improving patient retention. In fact, many of our DCT partners are talking about the longer engagement of participants in their trials, some quoting up to 28% longer than the industry average. There's also an increased access to a patient population. Traditionally, patients enrolled in trials have been from a very narrow demographic, and 70% of participants don't really live within 2 hours of a conventional clinical site. What we can do now with DCTs is we're really enabled to recruit study populations much more representative of the real world population. We can recruit underrepresented or traditionally underrepresented racial or ethnic groups, and ultimately recruit a more diverse community within our clinical studies. And lastly, something perhaps we don't always think about a little bit from decentralized trials, but because of the readily available nature of some of the technology we use, whether that be mobile or connected devices, we enable the more timely and frequent data capture of critical data points from participants enrolled in the trial. This may be active collection or fully passive in terms of the use of wearable data. And this can enable us to deliver more timely reporting of adverse events and to capture fluctuations in disease signs and symptoms that have often been missed through traditional periodic site visits. Now, DCTs is a rapidly evolving space, and not least has there been a number of organizations that are really seeking to help the organization and the industry as a whole to get their arms around the space of DCT, to harmonize how we think about decentralized trials. In particular, the ePRO, the DTRA, a recently formed alliance of entities, and City have all working hard to share tools for implementation and guidance, sharing best practices, and also perhaps help in the commonality of definitions around what we mean for DCTs. The DIME, Digital Medicine Society, is also a group out in the US which have been working hard to develop a playbook of how digital endpoints can be deployed and developed in trials. And I've also built a library of all of the digital measures that have ever been run, or at least reported by sponsors to have been run on their clinical studies, which is a very valuable resource in terms of as we start to think about using the technology available to us to collect more objective and continuous assessments in our trials. Regulators too have been very active in this space. Not recently, the Danish Medicine Agency just published their guidance on how to implement decentralized elements in clinical trials. And of course, the FDA released its guidance right at the height of, or should I say, the beginning of the pandemic last year, to really give guidance on how sponsors should continue to conduct clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic, and shared guidance on a number of DCT components, including telemedicine, direct-to-patient shipment of IP, and home nursing. I encourage you to certainly look at all of this guidance, and if you can, engage with these various entities. This guidance will continue to be updated regularly, as this is, as I said, a rapidly evolving space. And these are some great sources of information and tools that you can readily use. Now, I mentioned the pandemic on my previous slide, and this has, of course, really accelerated the adoption of decentralized trial approaches, and indeed also remote monitoring solutions. And, essentially, wind the clock back 18 months, COVID really did threaten study continuity and delayed the startup of new studies. Patients were not able to visit sites in person, and CRAs were not able to perform their conventional site-based monitoring visits. Indeed, quotes from some of our CRO partners were that at least 50% of sites were inaccessible during the COVID pandemic. Now, sponsors did enact continuity plans, and in these obviously included decentralized approaches and remote monitoring approaches to allow clinical trials to conduct. And I think this was really a wonderful example of how these two technology platforms are really a perfect combination of how the technology can enable not just clinical trial conduct during the pandemic, but also for the future in terms of how we can enable better, faster, cheaper, and safer trials for our participants, and ultimately bring drugs to patients sooner. Now, just to provide you with some little insights into what people are now saying now that the height of the pandemic is over, although we're still very much living through the COVID-19 pandemic, that a number of industry representatives who have implemented DCT approaches during the COVID-19 pandemic, not least 76% of those that were surveyed, have also indicated that more than half of their studies are now decentralized. And in the RBQM space, one of our own surveys of the implementation of RBQM is now reporting that about 81% of representatives are now either fully implemented or are in the process of implementing RBQM. Now, pre-pandemic, I thought it would be interesting to have a little bit of a look at where we were before the pandemic hit, and indeed the adoption of DCT was already well on the way. This was a nice slide presented by Ken Getz recently of analysis done by Tufts in terms of the types of data that were now forming part of standard protocols. And you could see even back in 2018 when this data was pulled together that smartphone devices, eCOA, eSource information, mobile health and wearable devices were already starting to feature quite significantly in our clinical trial protocols. And perhaps more poignant was that sponsors and CROs were forecasting that these elements would be, over the next 3 years, ultimately become very dominant features of our trial protocols, and in some cases, such as eCOA, almost in 100% of cases. So we've talked a little bit about the evolving landscape of trials, the benefits, and ultimately how the world is rapidly evolving, and that this is can be considered really as the future of how we're going to be conducting our trials and monitoring our data. I think before I move into the next bit of our webinar, which is to look at where we think about the key sources of risk, I was interested in the audience's participation and your thoughts on where you perceive or have you experienced the biggest risk in DCTs that you've either executed today or are planning to execute. And some of the options for you to consider are as follows. You know, are you particularly concerned about differences between virtual or in-person site visits where you're implementing both routes for patients in your trial? Perhaps variability in technology that you're deploying that might impact or bias the data that you're capturing. Are you concerned about using both BYOD and provisioned methods for supplying devices to participants, and will those different modes add variability to the data that you're collecting? And are you concerned about inconsistency of the administration of IP, in particular where that is self-directed by the participants? So as you're thinking about those options, I will just wait and see for some of the results to come in. And this is quite interesting. Before we ran this poll, I was sort of trying to think a little bit about what we might expect to see. And my thought was that perhaps if you think about the key sources and of risk could be in that the different components of both virtual and person visits, in particular, perhaps the inconsistency of administration of IP, given the impact that that could have on trial execution. I am particularly interested in that the majority of participants see that there's potential variability in the technology, and I think that is quite insightful. It's not necessarily something that we naturally think about, but as we come through the next stage of my presentation, I'll share some examples of where we've actually seen that and manifest itself. So next component of the webinar is to, as I mentioned, to explore some of the risks in decentralized trials. And I first wanted to start by just perhaps casting our mind back to the way in which we conduct conventional trials and the way in which we think about monitoring data collected in a traditional study. And in particular, the way we often think about this is to monitor data in the dimensions of how data is collected. And so in a conventional study, we think about that at the patient, the site, and the country or region level. With regards to patients, we are mainly thinking about their safety and if their continued journey through the trial and data capture is consistent. And are we able to detect where there are anomalous results that indicate that that's not the case? At the site level, we're asking ourselves how are sites operationalizing the protocol, and is that consistent under the leadership of an investigator? We're often comparing site data from one site to the rest of the sites involved in the trial, which gives us insights into how the trial might be running, and if indeed there are any sites that are having challenges in operationalizing the protocol. And then at the country level or region level, we're asking ourselves the question, are there specific regional or geographical dynamics that can influence the trial success and the integrity of the data? Now, in a decentralized trial, when we ask ourselves, where are the sources of risk? Are they the same in traditional studies or are they different? And I think we can categorize these new sources of risk into two areas that essentially arise as a result of the delegation of accountability and responsibility for data collection and other study procedures like administration of IMP outside the confines and control of a conventional clinical site. The first of those is around the new entities such as home healthcare providers or local pharmacies, or indeed the same entities but with new accountabilities such as participants and investigators, where unfamiliarity with new technology or their experience or lack of, and perhaps a misunderstanding of their roles and responsibilities results in end user error, misuse of the technology, and erroneous data. The other is in the technology itself, and are these additional modalities of data collection adding variability and risk into our trial execution. No technology is flawless, and in particular when we consider decentralized trials, we're looking at telemedicine and eCOA and wearable and connected devices. And given the frequency of data acquisition with these new types of techniques, this is perhaps arguably a more challenging concept of how we monitor this sort of data than we would have considered under traditional methods. And really, traditional man-powered, person-powered data monitoring tools and techniques are going to be not going to really be able to manage and monitor this type of data. And really, we need to look for more automated statistical tools and techniques to monitor this larger volumes of data. So in a hybrid or fully decentralized trial, we have this concept of new dimensions of risk, where new independent entities that are sources of study activity and data collection, where perhaps poor appreciation or lack of appreciation of the protocol or understanding of the protocol or misuse is really impacting data reliability and patient safety. So I now want to sort of shift gears a little bit and take a deep dive into some of the individual components of decentralized trials, and through our own experience of having supported sponsors execute such studies, where do we see the risk opportunities, and how might central monitoring be deployed to help detect those risks and those emerging risks? So let's start with telemedicine. This is essentially where healthcare professional evaluations can be performed remotely using audio and video telecommunications technology. And in clinical trial protocols, as I said at the beginning, we often see telemedicine implemented as the sole route where an investigator is engaging with participants for capturing data remotely. But there are a number of protocols where multiple routes of the investigator is deploying to engage in patients and capture data. And this is exemplified here by this schematic here on the left-hand side, where patients may be engaging solely through remote methods and telemedicine is used to capture data, or they may be engaging through conventional and traveling on site to have the investigator in person collect and capture their data. Indeed, it may be that certain visits within the protocol have also been decentralized, where the investigator can use telemedicine to conduct those visits remotely. The other component here or dimension is that telemedicine is not completely infallible, and often it's wise to incorporate in your protocol that where possible or where allowed, that investigators can use and perform those visits remotely by using a phone in the event of technical failures of the telemedicine technology. But as we think about this particular paradigm, are there differences across these different modes of data collection that we should be concerned about? And perhaps to kind of deep down, go a level down further than that, is where we're perhaps using telemedicine to capture and report adverse events. Would we be concerned about the different reporting rates of adverse events through these different mechanisms that we should monitor and have oversight of? The next element that I wanted to take a bit of a deeper dive into was the home healthcare provider. Essentially, healthcare professionals who are, for all intents and purposes, acting like a conventional site. They perform multiple evaluations or administer IMP, but instead of doing that in the hospital, they're doing that in the home environment of the participant themselves, and they are capturing data directly into eSource solutions. The important point to make here is that, like a site, they are often acting and collecting data from multiple participants. So one of the things that we consider about in this particular paradigm is where you have a home healthcare provider responsible for a group of participants, and you have multiple healthcare providers in your trial. Is that a dimension of risk that is adding variability in your study? Are all healthcare providers acting in the same way? Is there misunderstanding of the trial protocol or carelessness in how that protocol is being implemented by one particular healthcare provider? Is there a lack of appropriate training or qualification, or perhaps malfunction in some of the devices or miscalibration that they're using to capture some of this data in the patient's home environment? And as I mentioned earlier, if we are reporting adverse events through this, has that misunderstanding or carelessness impacted things like adverse event reporting rates? And so you can start to see this buildup of the picture a little bit of how, in the concept of a decentralized trial, monitoring your data in the dimension of the home healthcare provider could be a very sensible approach, in a similar way in which in traditional studies we would have monitored the data at the site level. Now, whether or not you can decentralize IMP administration really does depend upon the route of administration of the study drug and the safety profile of the IMP concerned. There are other considerations, such as the process for handling adverse events and the adequate storage conditions in the home of the trial participant. But one of the wonderful recent innovations really in the past 5 or so years has been how the improved tracking of administration and use of IMP in clinical trials through technologies such as smart blister packs and injection pens, smart inhalers for inhaled formulations, but this also includes topical medications like creams and lotions. And when considering the decentralization of how IMP is administered, again, to paint the picture a little bit, I would like to walk you through this little schematic diagram of how we've seen this been implemented on a number of protocols. In effect, what can happen is a home healthcare provider can have the responsibility to train a participant in the proper administration of the IMP, including any prior preparation, the frequency, the duration of any dose, its coverage if perhaps this was a topical medication, what times of day do they need to be taken, the differences between when you take your medication and perhaps other assessments that you need to take during that week or even that day, and whether they are self-reported assessments or need to be scheduled at a specific time of a home healthcare provider visit. They'll also be trained in the proper storage of the investigational product and how use or non-use and return of IMP is delivered back to a local pharmacy that has responsibility for the dispensing and return of unused or used study drug to the central trial coordinators. We also see in many protocols the ability and the inclusion of an e-diary for participants to report IMP self-administration. It's particularly useful in terms of tracking either automatically or through an e-diary, in this case, how the participant is using the IMP in the trial. And so when we think about sources of risk, we think about here, obviously, predominantly the inconsistent use of IMP, and that could be at the level of the participant, that they have misunderstood or misinterpreted the training, or that could be at the level of the home healthcare provider in terms of their delivery of that training, or perhaps some carelessness in how that was delivered that means the participant has not fully understood. Then obviously there is the inconsistent reporting of drug accountability that could be at any dimension across this whole paradigm, as all the home healthcare provider, the participant, and the pharmacy are all involved in the correct either the training or the reporting of that information. Now, lastly, I want to just talk about some of the more novel types of data, device data. This is providing us with a huge opportunity to collect more granular and objective data in our clinical trials. I won't go through all of these on this slide, but I think this is all forefront in many of our minds of the opportunity that presents itself through the proliferation and the developments in biosensors in mobile device and technologies. But there is a wide array of risk in this sort of data that comes with the benefits that I just talked about. And again, to walk you through an example of how this can be typically operationalized in a trial, you often have a device vendor who's responsible for programming and provisioning the device. You may have a home health provider who's responsible for training in the proper use of that device, its setup, when it needs to be used, the time of day, any time post an invention, the frequency and duration of its use. And then that participant will also have responsibility for sending their device data to a place where it can be analyzed, and that may be analyzed by an expert in the field, visually or audibly, if that sort of data, or it may be analyzed by an algorithm to produce results. And so in terms of again, the sources of potential risk, there is potential variability in either lack of or too much variability or anonymous results in the device data itself. And that may be a result of the participant, or indeed the home healthcare provider in their training of the participant, or indeed that analysis vendor who's performing the analysis. There's also perhaps areas of risk around its inconsistent use, whether what times of day or the duration of its use, its failure or miscalibration, and that may be around specific batches of devices that have been distributed during the trial. Or you may want to look at an age-dependent bias that might be impacting the device data. Do you see that older populations or younger populations are struggling to implement and generate good device data, or other demographic groups within your trial population? And then also, are we seeing issues with the analysis vendor who is responsible for analyzing the data? Is there differences between the raters? Are there cycle time challenges in terms of the time at which data was analyzed from the time at which it was provided? Or are we seeing a higher rate of change in expert assessors within an individual patient set of longitudinal data? And finally, we have a very similar set of sort of potential areas of risk for ePRO or e-diary data. This is similar to the previous slide, so I won't go through this too much detail, but to say that, as we talked about in the participant poll, was that there may be additional differences in BYOD and provisional devices that might add bias to your data that you might want to consider. So another opportunity for your thoughts in this webinar. And the question I'd like to ask is, having talked a little bit about the sources of risk, is really, where do you see the biggest opportunity to improve data quality oversight in DCT execution using perhaps tools such as centralized monitoring? Do you see that in improved oversight and analysis of the audit trail data I hinted a little bit to that in the example with the device data and the timing and the duration of when assessments are being performed or when devices are being used. Are you particularly excited by the opportunity of being able to monitor the new dimensions of risk? We talked about those being perhaps at the level of the home healthcare provider who is operating almost like a conventional site. Or do you see a good opportunity in how we can detect differences across modes of data collection, whether that be virtual or conventional methods? Or are you most excited about the opportunity to ensure reliable IP administration? So again, I will just wait for the answers to come in. And this is a very interesting view. And again, I think similarly to what we saw in the previous poll, the new dimensions of risk is coming across as quite a significant part, in particular where we have things like home healthcare providers or local pharmacies operationalizing parts of our trials. And indeed, neck and neck for second place, we have the oversight around audit trail data and also the different modes of data collection. Now, what I will do now is I'd like to take you through a little bit about some examples of how we've employed central monitoring tools to monitor these sorts of risk, and to also share with you some use cases, real life use cases of how we've detected and used perhaps some of these types of data like audit trail data to identify areas of risk. So I painted a little bit of a picture of some of the areas of risk in decentralized trials, and I certainly don't want you to leave this webinar thinking that DCTs are too risky. Far from it. And I think one of the exciting opportunities that I'm particularly excited about has been that in balancing those new areas of risk, we also have opportunities for more effective risk detection through the nature of how DCTs are being executed. You know, the faster accrual data, the more readily available nature of that data, the higher proportion of e-source, and the more near-time access to the data that we've generated. I mentioned the audit trail information as well. So the timestamps, the duration, the users who have provided that information can all help in improving the oversight of data quality. Now, when we think about central monitoring, there are numerous tools that we can deploy. And I just wanted to perhaps just take a little step back to sort of say, well, what are those central monitoring? What are the sort of tools in our arsenal to have oversight of data in general in clinical trials? Starting from the left, we obviously, of course, have our risk assessment approach to provide a proactive assessment of key risks in critical data and critical processes, and documenting how we may mitigate those risks. We have study level QTLs, which allow us to monitor study-wide risks against predefined thresholds, and also monitor their performance against where we expect them to be. We have KRIs that are traditionally deployed at a site level, but can also be deployed at other dimensions, where crossing predefined thresholds or a relative comparison to performance at all of the sites in the trial can indicate where there is a failing site, or perhaps in the context of a DCT, a failing home healthcare provider. We then have statistical interrogation tools, and we also have the ability to review data at the patient level. Now, when we think about decentralized trials, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a view of having painted some risks and now talking a little bit about central monitoring. How might we set up and deploy these tools in a study to monitor the sort of risks that we've talked about? So, as I mentioned, at the study level, there may be specific metrics that we might want to monitor. For example, recruitment and recruitment at the study overall, or specific elements of the population, the reporting of adverse events, or the use of investigational medical product. And what we are able to do with some central monitoring tools is to do side-by-side comparisons of traditional and virtual site recruitment methods or modes of data collection to demonstrate how they may be impacting the study level metrics. We can also use KRIs in new dimensions, such as at the home healthcare provider or at local pharmacies, to compare the performance of different entities and detect whether issues in training or data collection or IMP administration or drug accountability are impacting study execution. We can also do side-by-side comparisons of traditional and virtual sites, or even different modes of data collection, such as telemedicine versus conventional, or BYOD versus provisioned, to understand whether that is adding any bias to our data. On the patient level side, similarly, we're looking at anomalous results of IMP administration or reporting rates of adverse events, or even just detecting anomalous results in key critical data, whether that would be lack of variability or too much variability, or propagation of key results, or the timestamps at which that data was captured, and was that consistent with what we expected to see. We're also, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, that we can use statistical tools and patient level review to also detect anomalies in how central raters may be performing. Now, before we get to the end of the webinar, I just wanted to share some real-world examples. And I have 3 here of how we have been detecting, in the sorts of data we collect in decentralized trials, how we have detected anomalies. And this particular example was in the analysis of audit trail data from ePRO, where we were looking at specifically the timestamps of when data was collected. And this was from a phase 3 study and in about 500 patients and across 50 different centers. And what we detected in one particular center, which would treated 15 patients, that in nearly all of the ePRO data, there was a consistent reporting of the data results at the same hour of the day across all patients. And what this highlighted actually was a fraudulent reporting of all of the ePRO results, because the the site failed to distribute the ePRO devices to patients, and so we're inventing patient level data. And sadly, this obviously resulted in the sponsor closing the center, but it just gives you a nice example of how audit trail data can surface up, perhaps in this case fraudulent behavior, but perhaps also where there may be misunderstanding of the trial protocol. Another example here was in the detection of miscalibrated devices, in this case thermometers. In a trial we were involved in, this was a vaccine study, shipped a lot of devices to across a broad number of countries, and an analysis, statistical analysis at the country level, identified that a certain batch of devices that were in fact shipped to all the patients in Spain were actually miscalibrated, and although we're perhaps capturing data within normal ranges, were ultimately not calibrated properly and not measuring temperature accurately. And this was detected through a statistical analysis, and so something that would perhaps be missed when performing normal sort of data monitoring review. And the last example I have here is about reporting of IMP administration. In this particular example, we detected that there was lack of variability, again, in time intervals between patients self-reporting IMP injections through ePRO data. Ultimately, what we identified here was that that there was some fraudulent behavior going on in terms of how this IMP administration was reported from that patient diary data. But again, as you can see from the deep analysis, we can detect whether or not the expected behavior we're seeing in the trial is actually what we would envisage would be normal for this particular patient population, and normal in terms of how the protocol has been operationalized. Now, before I end, I just wanted to share with you a perhaps more forward-looking view of where we see some opportunities to go beyond what we can deploy today to maximize data quality and oversight of data in DCTs, and perhaps think a little bit ahead of areas where we can improve on that even further. And one of those, I believe, is in terms of how we can share insights that we get from central monitoring into those stakeholders that are responsible for interactions with other stakeholders in the trial, whether that be participants, home healthcare providers, and to allow them to action quickly remedial actions and efficiently resolve that perhaps may coincide with a home visit or an interaction with a participant, so that if there are identifications in lack of training or appreciation of the protocol or misunderstanding or device malfunction, that they can be rapidly resolved as part of the normal clinical trial conduct. The other area, again, I'm quite excited about is, as well as all the sort of clinical and operational and audit trail data, because of that sort of deep end user engagement metrics we can also capture through DCT platforms, there's the potential that we can detect or even predict how well patients are engaging in our trials. Can we predict potential dropout or missed assessments and intervene prior to those things happening so that we can improve engagement of participants in our studies and ultimately maximize the success of clinical trial conduct? And so with that, please let me summarize. And again, I come back to a point I made at the beginning of the talk, in that I think as we look forward into how we are going to conduct our clinical trials, decentralized trials and risk-based quality monitoring and centralized statistical monitoring tools really provide the perfect partnership to maximizing study execution. DCTs, DCT approaches can significantly benefit our trial conduct, and that's been more evidence during COVID in terms of how we were able to continue with clinical trial conduct and mitigate those risks. Risk in DCT execution arise because we're essentially devolving accountability for study activity outside the conventional clinical site. And risks can typically be categorized into two areas of the independent players that are now sources of study activity and new technologies and modalities that we are now deploying. The monitoring challenge is perhaps greater in the DCT environment, given the millions, if not billions, of data points that we're now capturing. And so more automated and statistical central monitoring tools really lend themselves exceptionally well to identifying anomalous points in all of this data rapidly and efficiently. New sources of risk really and the large volumes of data can be effectively assessed and monitored using RBQM and automated centralized statistical monitoring tools. And the monitoring of audit data has particularly been shown to be valuable in surfacing otherwise undetectable anomalous data. And finally, as I mentioned, I think we're excited about the opportunity to further enhance the benefits of DCTs by improving stakeholder access to the sorts of insights that we can surface, and the analysis of end user engagement metrics to ultimately improve the engagement of participants in clinical trials and avoid unnecessary dropout and missed visits. With that, I will end and just thank you for your interest and thank you for your attention. And I'll now hand it back to Rich, who can get us through perhaps the Q&A section. But thank you very much.
John, brilliant. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. And yeah, lots of input in the Q&A section. So I can pick out a few of these and we'll get through as many as we can in the 10 minutes remaining. So that's brilliant. First one, and this is specific to, or it's asking specifically about CluePoints experience, because it's asking about our established customer base. And in terms of those decentralized areas that you've talked about, things like the wearables and the IMP, home administration and those kind of things. Thinking of those decentralized components, what have we seen adopted by the organizations that we've been working with so far?
Yeah, that's a super question, Rich. And actually, I should have also said, we actually have on the call a few other people on the CluePoints team, Steve Young, our CSO, yourself, of course, Richard, who are our VP of Solutions, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Let me start with this one, and then I'll invite others on the call to add their comments. So, I mean, I think in the terms of decentralized approaches, I'll go back to that original slide we had. We've been collecting ePRO data for a number of years, and indeed, CluePoints a lot of experience in collecting and analyzing and remotely monitoring ePRO data. The sorts of issues that we have surfaced are some of the things I presented on today about the consistent use and reporting of information in ePRO data. We've also run trials fully siteless trials, in particular in COVID-19, in the development and supporting the development of COVID vaccines. And so that concept of a site, or that dimension of a site, was no longer applicable in those sorts of studies. And indeed, we've also been involved in the execution of trials that have incorporated telemedicine, as I talked about, and indeed also wearable data. But yeah, I think in terms of CluePoints experience, it goes back a long way in terms of isolated use of individual components of DCTs, and then in particular in more recent times and during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were actually also supporting fully siteless studies that were perhaps more novel and innovative in their approach and design.
Yeah, thanks, John. And that actually leads in. Leads into a follow-up question here, which was around COVID and what kind of acceleration we've seen over the last 18 months.
So I think in terms of acceleration, I would say has been predominantly around. We've seen that in terms of the adoption that I talked about at the beginning of the slide in the use of centralized monitoring. You know, in COVID-19 pandemic, we weren't able, CRAs weren't able to go on site, perform conventional monitoring approaches. So sponsors, sought to adapt and adopt central approaches to monitoring the data to enable effective oversight of the data that they were still capturing. In the DCT space, I think what we have seen is an acceleration from perhaps studies that use isolated components of DCTs, like the consistent use of ePRO across all sites, the consistent use of eConsent, and rather where we're now seeing studies that are either using fully remote sites as part of their site portfolio. So as I'll go back to that beginning slide. So as well as traditional sites, they're incorporating virtual sites in their trials, and indeed also taking fully decentralized trials, and that's been more particularly around in the development of COVID therapies. But I think Steve was also going to add something, and I'll just let him comment as well. But
thanks, John. Not too much to add. Was just going to reinforce your point about our experience with DCTs, and just comment that I think most of our experience probably is in that eCOA, ePRO area, but absolutely in the last year or two, and certainly spurred on by the pandemic, we're getting more what I would say truly decentralized, where you have virtual sites or home healthcare providers instead of actual brick and mortar sites and trials, and so we're rapidly gaining experience in working with sponsors and CRO partners on how to monitor risk ideally in those situations. And John has pointed out how, kind of given indications of how we do it, using, for instance, home healthcare provider as a key dimension of risk for identifying anomalies or risk patterns in data, or using the local pharmacy or central readers of key endpoint data or key assessments, where that's happening more and more. So, but certainly for many, many years, ePRO and eCOA data have been out there. They've just been steadily increasing in usage. And we've developed a lot of expertise in terms of how to optimally identify risk coming from those sources. And John, you mentioned the audit trail data, and that was, and what we found is audit trail data in particular can be extremely helpful in identifying problems in the deployment and usage of those technologies in these settings.
Wonderful, thanks, Steve. That actually kind of leads into another question I see here. Someone had asked for a very specific, or if we had a specific example that we could share around detecting emergent risk in decentralized components. And I know we've talked about the audit trail there, but just when you were talking about the questionnaires, that always makes me think about kind of variability issues that we've seen in patient-reported outcome data as well. That's a good area. I don't know if there's anything you can share with that one, Steve.
I'm sorry, what was the specific question, Rich? Was it about?
Looking for specific examples of where we've detected emergent risk in decentralized components. But I was then thinking towards questionnaire data and some of the other examples we've got around variability of, too much variability and unplausible response patterns in that kind of data. Wondered if there was anything you could share on those kind of examples.
Yeah, there's been an increasing number in the area of ePRO specifically. Yeah, so patient direct collected data on various types of ePRO devices where we've identified with customers strange patterns of usage, either time of day. There was the one example John already cited about that actually turned out to be fraud, but there's been other anomalous patterns that have led to identification of issues in training and or usage by patients, and often associated or stemming from mistraining from a given site or home healthcare provider. We're actually currently, it's on the top of my mind because there's actually a current situation with a study that had a group of centralized readers that were assessors responsible for assessing the primary endpoint. There's still brick and mortar sites in that trial, but there's an identified real concern in terms of unusual patterns of the endpoint data across the assessors in that trial. So another current good example.
Thank you, that's fantastic. I'm looking through the Q&A and with a minute to go here, I don't think we'll get the opportunity to do any of the remaining questions justice. So firstly, John, thank you for a fantastic presentation, and also Steve for your support here today as well. And of course, thank you to all of the audience who've given an hour of their time to come and join us with this today. I hope it's been really interesting and stimulating information for you. The recording will be available to you, and of course, you can also request a copy of the slides at contact@cluepoints.com. So just remains for me to thank you all for your attendance, and look forward to you joining a subsequent webinar with us soon.